Okay. So I am going to start my talk with a disclaimer that I actually developed this presentation in 2023, and due to the pace of research in PFAS and toxicity, some of the things I'm going to talk about have already been updated. So that's my little disclaimer before I get started. When I was putting this presentation together, I sort of made a list of what I thought were meaningful questions that I wanted to explore with my research. And I'm going to focus on some of the latter ones, which are, what really seems to be the correlation between environmental levels of PFAS with blood serum levels, and are those blood serum levels correlated with adverse effects, and are they statistically significant? And do the measurements of some of the biomarkers we're focusing on translate into actual disease occurrence? And I partially answered some of those questions with this. A quick review of what are some of the non-cancer effects that are associated with PFAS exposure. There's both animal studies and human studies. And animal studies, PFAS exposure has been linked to immune system damage, liver damage, teratogenic effects, and birth defects and developmental effects. Whereas the epidemiological studies or human studies suggest that PFAS may increase, thyroid disease, blood cholesterol levels, decreased immune response to vaccines, decreased fertility, and increased risks of preeclampsia and lower infant birth weight. And note the word suggest. Some of these are biomarkers or precursors to effects versus actual current manifestation of effects. And this slide's actually getting a little outdated. When I put it together, it was, I would say, more of a mixed bag of what different agencies and groups, how they were classifying, in particular PFOA and PFOS. I think now there is more consistency between groups. With respect to PFOA, I would say there's a decent amount of human epidemiological evidence for association of elevated PFOA serum exposure with cancer of the testes, and as well as for kidney and some other cancer sites, more limited positive associations for bladder, thyroid, prostate, but a lot of those results were inconsistent, didn't follow necessarily kind of a clear dose response, and based on small number of participants. PFOS, evidence of liver tumors in rats, and sort of, again, mixed evidence of bladder, prostate, kidney, breast in humans. But I would say more recent research is indicating, I would say, a higher level of association with cancers, especially kidney and testicular. I just wanted to spend one moment on the EPA MCLs and health advisories, fresh off the presses, that they did finalize the 4 parts per trillion for PFAS and PFOA for the MCLs. And I just thought it was interesting to note that both of those are based on reporting limits. They're based on the PQL because the actual risk-based levels are too low to reliably measure. So that's what they defaulted to for that. And then some of these other PFAS, it's at 10 parts per trillion, and they're still retaining the hazard index approach for mixtures of those 4 PFAS. As someone else, I think, already said, the MCL goal, it's 0 for anything that's considered a likely carcinogen or carcinogenic. So for both PFAS and PFOA, the goal is 0. And as we all know, MCLs also have to consider economic and technical feasibility, and a cost-benefit analysis was performed. I just wanted to explore for a second, because I think it's interesting, relative to the epidemiological review I'm going to be doing, to take a look at those health advisories that were issued in 2022, 2023 timeframe for PFOA and PFOS, which I think just shocked a lot of people with how low they were. And just the derivation of these health-based water concentrations or health advisories consider what's known as a relative source contribution. And regulatory agencies usually use 20% for drinking water, which means that whatever they think the, quote unquote, safe dose is, health-based dose for drinking water should be, they then divide it by a factor of 5 to account for the fact that your total dose is also going to be from other sources, like we've heard dietary, dust in the home, potentially inhalation. Both PFAS and PFOA were based, those very, very tiny reference doses we're seeing, they were based on study looking at decreased immune response to a tetanus vaccine in children, and there was an uncertainty factor of 10 applied to that. So that's how EPA came up with the 4 parts per quadrillion for PFOA health advisory and the 20 parts per quadrillion for PFAS. Before I launch into my very quick review of some epidemiological studies, I just wanted to make sure people understood the 3 main types of studies and the measures that we consider when we're looking at epidemiology studies. So cohort, you're following a group of people that's maybe they're both exposed and not exposed to PFAS, and it can either be forward-looking, prospective, or retrospective, and we calculate a relative risk. Case control, you're comparing cases of a specific health effect, let's say testicular cancer, with controls which don't have testicular cancer, and it's always retrospective, and you're looking at an odds ratio. And that's simply the ratio, the odds of the effect in one group versus the odds of the effect in the other group. So for PFAS, it was looking at the odds of that effect in exposed versus unexposed populations. So when there's no, and then cross-sectional is you're just collecting exposure and health data across a whole population to determine the prevalence at a given point in time. And a lot of cross-sectional studies, they might do check-ins on either an annual basis or every 5 years. And those use both odds ratios and relative risks. So when the relative risks or the odds ratio are the same, in other words, that the exposed population and the unexposed population have the same basically risk, that's 1, and that means that there isn't an association between the exposure and the outcome. The 4 studies I'm going to touch upon today are the C8 Health Study, the Australian National University PFAS Health Study focusing on component 2, which looked at blood serum, the Steenland and Winquist study, which looked at PFAS exposure in cancer. It was really a meta study. And then a quick I'll touch upon the NCI Working Group on PFAS, which has a lot of interesting studies that they've performed and mostly that are ongoing. So the C8 Health Project was born out of the settlement from the DuPont, West Virginia class action lawsuit. And part of the settlement was that the money would fund what's known as a C8 science panel, where they were going to study close to 70,000 people who lived near the plant whose drinking water had been impacted and collect blood serum data from those people and evaluate close to 30 different endpoints, which I have listed here, and trying to understand whether or not there was a probable link between the primary contaminant, in that case was PFOA, between PFOA exposure and disease. And what the C8 Health Study found was that for 6 of those 30 endpoints that were evaluated, it was concluded that there was a probable link between PFOA exposure, primarily again through the drinking water impacts and those endpoints. So they had what the effect was, in other words, what kind of adverse effect could happen. And then I also listed what endpoints they looked at. So again, the endpoints they looked at doesn't necessarily mean that the effect happened, but that it's considered an indicator of the likelihood of that effect to happen. So cholesterol, pregnancy-induced high blood pressure, ulcerative colitis, hyper and hypothyroidism, and then the 2 cancers that you've been hearing a lot about today, kidney and testicular. All of those were concluded to have a probable link to the PFOA exposure. The Australian study was really interesting. It was basically a case control study. And what they did is they looked at blood serum levels in populations in three AFFF foam impacted areas where AFFF foam had impacted the water supply. They also separately evaluated things like bore water, dietary impacts, and worker exposure to AFFF. I'm not going to talk about those here, but those are all in this really interesting health study. And they focus on select health outcomes. And the first thing, and then they also looked at three non-impacted areas. So pretty similar population sizes and socioeconomic, et cetera, except that three of the water supplies were not impacted, three were. And so one thing they found is definitely that there were higher blood serum levels of PFOS and PFHXS in the drinking water impacted areas, and that the higher blood serum was associated with higher cholesterol and uric acid levels. There was sufficient evidence to indicate that, although the researchers said they were small differences and unlikely to be important to health. I'm just quoting what they said here. And then there was limited evidence of kidney health impacts, vaccine immune response, and kidney and testicular cancers, but they were generally not statistically significant. What they really found to be significantly higher in the exposed, drinking water areas was psychological distress and self-harm, including, unfortunately, suicide. And I think this is interesting because it ties into one of the first talks of this panel where they were looking at what were people looking online. And as we all, so people definitely were very concerned about the contamination of their drinking water supply and are also inundated probably on a daily basis with, unfortunately, sometimes kind of hyperbolic news reports. So I thought that was very interesting. The Steenland and Winquist study was a meta study. They looked at 16 different cohort or case control studies. They limited it to studies looking at PFAS and PFOA. Only a few of those studies were what I would call general population studies. The rest were primarily worker studies or studies near a plant like the DuPont plant. And the strongest evidence of association between exposure and testicular and kidney cancer was really in the occupational studies, and that was really where they found the strongest connection. In the general population cohort studies, they found they did find some elevated risks for select cancer sites. However, those were really again, near things like the West Virginia plant. Two of the studies found a slight association for prostate and pancreatic. And when they looked at a general population study of elderly people greater than 60 years, that includes me. I don't know why I'm saying that's elderly. They didn't really find an association between PFAS serum levels and cancer mortality. And then again, they looked at these case control studies. Breast cancer in general, there wasn't a lot of association between serum levels for PFOA and PFOS, but there was some weak association with estrogen positive tumors, but there wasn't a clear dose response relationship. Prostate, the only time they found a positive association is if there was a genetic component like a BRCA gene. And the kidney study, after they adjusted for multiple PFAS, they did find a positive association for PFOA and kidney cancer. NCIS, yep, I'm trying to make it through. NCIS, they were looking again at PFAS exposures and serum levels and looking at cancer. They did find PFOA related to an increased cancer risk for kidney cancers, and they have a number of studies in progress. This is just a summary of everything I just said. And I guess I would say science is rapidly expanding, new studies all the time. I really hope there's more focus on the connection between exposure and blood serum, as well as the biomarkers versus the manifestation of effects in disease. And that's all I have. I welcome any questions.
So we're about at time with 20 seconds left. So I'm going to recommend that people connect on Whova for questions later.